All right, so picture this. You're in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
The year is 2005. Hurricane Katrina has just ripped through the city,
Right.
leaving devastation in its wake. The power's out streets are flooded,
Yeah.
and the familiar structures of society are crumbling. What do you think happens next?
Hmm.
Do people band together, or is it every man for himself?
It's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of...
It's a question that cuts right to the core of today's deep dive,
Okay.
the nature of humanity.
Yeah, this scenario you're painting is a real-life test of a concept that's fascinated thinkers for centuries.
Right.
It's called the thin veneer theory.
It's a chilling thought, right?
It is.
And you've probably heard those stories, the ones that reinforce the idea that when the going gets tough,
Yeah.
humans revert to their basest instincts. But what if those stories aren't the whole picture?
That's what we're going to unpack today. We've got some fascinating sources lined up.
Okay.
Historical arguments that set the stage for this debate. A look at a famous psychological experiment that seemed to prove the thin veneer theory, and then some real-world examples that challenge those very assumptions.
And it's not just an intellectual exercise, is it? This idea, this question of whether we're inherently good or bad,
Right.
it touches every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
How we raise our kids, the kind of society we build, even the way we react in a crisis. If you're intrigued by those big questions about human nature,
Yeah.
you're in the right place.
Yeah.
Make sure you hit that subscribe button
Absolutely.
so you don't miss a single episode of our deep dives. Now, to kick things off, let's go back in time a few centuries. We're talking about those philosophical heavyweights,
Okay.
Hobbes and Rousseau.
Ah, yes, the classic clash of perspectives.
Right.
We've got excerpts here from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan,
Oh.
written in the 1600s, a time of intense social upheaval in England. It's a rather bleak view of humanity, but one that shaped political thought for centuries.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. What was Hobbes' take?
Hobbes believed that in our natural state, humans are driven by self-preservation,
Okay.
and that without a strong authority figure to keep us in check, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
He doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
No, he doesn't.
So basically he's arguing for a powerful government, a Leviathan to control our inherent savagery.
That's right.
I can see why that resonated in a time of civil war.
Absolutely. It's a perspective born out of a very specific historical context. But about a century later, along comes Jean-Jacques Rousseau,
Okay.
offering a very different vision of human nature.
So Rousseau, what's his story?
Rousseau believed that humans are inherently good, born free, and compassionate.
Yeah.
He saw society with its inequalities and power structures as the corrupting force, not our inherent nature. He argues that civilization is what creates the veneer,
Right.
and that beneath it we're essentially noble savages.
So we've got two brilliant minds, two completely different takes on who we are at our core. And honestly, these aren't just dusty old philosophical debates, are they? These ideas still reverberate in our world today.
I agree.
Think about how differently you would approach, say, criminal justice
Sure.
if you believed people were inherently bad versus inherently good.
Exactly. If you believe humans are naturally selfish and prone to violence, you might be inclined towards stricter laws, harsher punishments,
Right.
a more authoritarian approach overall. But if you believe in our innate goodness, you might lean towards rehabilitation, restorative justice, and a more compassionate system.
It's a fascinating lens through which to view contemporary issues.
It is.
It makes you wonder if these fundamental beliefs about human nature shape our entire social fabric, doesn't it? But these were still just theories, right?
Right.
So how do we move from philosophical debate to actually testing these ideas?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo attempted to do just that with a now infamous experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Ah, yes, the experiment that launched 1,000 ethics debates. This one's practically a pop culture legend.
It is.
But for those who haven't heard the story, walk us through it. What exactly happened in that basement at Stanford?
Well, Zimbardo created a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University. He recruited a group of college students, all deemed psychologically healthy, and randomly assigned them roles as either prisoners or guards.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
What could go wrong, right?
You'd think so.
Oh.
But here's where things took a dark turn. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it had to be shut down after just 6 days.
Wow, 6 days. What happened?
The guards, given minimal instructions, quickly became authoritarian and abusive.
Oh, wow.
They humiliated the prisoners, deprived them of sleep, and subjected them to psychological torture.
That's terrible.
The prisoners, in turn, became passive withdrawn and showed signs of extreme distress. It was a shocking display of how quickly seemingly ordinary people can transform into cruel and tyrannical figures when given power over others.
We have some audio clips from the experiment, and to be honest, they're incredibly disturbing to listen to.
I bet.
It really feels like you're witnessing the veneer of civilization cracking right before your eyes.
Oh.
Zimbardo's conclusion was that the situation, the environment,
Right.
had an overwhelming power to override individual morality.
Yeah.
Basically, he argued, we're all capable of becoming monsters under the right, or should I say wrong, circumstances.
And that's the message that resonated.
Yeah.
The Stanford prison experiment became a sensation, fueling the belief that beneath the surface, we're all just waiting for the right opportunity to unleash our inner demons. It's a powerful and disturbing narrative.
So it seemed like a slam dunk for the thin veneer theory, right?
It did.
But wait a minute. I remember hearing something of this experiment being debunked.
Yeah.
What's the real story?
Well, the Stanford prison experiment has come under intense scrutiny in recent years, and what's fascinating is that no one really dug into the archives of the experiment until relatively recently.
Okay, spill the tea. What'd they find?
Well, a sociologist named Thibault Letexier did a deep dive into the archives and unearthed some pretty damning evidence. It turns out that Zimbardo and his team were much more involved in shaping the guards' behavior than they initially let on.
Hold on, so you're saying they were encouraging the guards to be cruel?
Essentially, yes. They gave them specific instructions on how to create a sense of powerlessness and dehumanize the prisoners. Zimbardo even admitted in later interviews that he had actively coached the guards on how to be tough. It wasn't a spontaneous eruption of brutality. It was a carefully orchestrated performance.
Wow. So the experiment that supposedly proved we're all just wolves in sheep's clothing might have actually been rigged from the start.
It seems that way.
Which begs the question, why did it become so popular?
Right.
Why are we so quick to believe in our own capacity for evil?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's a compelling story, but is it actually true? To find out, I think we need to leave the controlled environment of the lab and look at what happens in the real world when chaos really does strike.
Yeah, to test this theory in the real world. We need like a real-life example of societal breakdown.
A real pressure test.
And what better example than Hurricane Katrina?
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And that's what we're going to do after. So we left off talking about Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, a real-life pressure test of this whole thin veneer idea.
Exactly. You have this breakdown of order, resources are scarce, people are under immense stress.
Yeah.
It feels like the perfect breeding ground for chaos, doesn't it?
You would think so.
Sure.
And that's certainly the image that a lot of people have of what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina.
It's a powerful narrative. You had widespread flooding, power outages, communication breakdowns, and the media at the time was filled with reports of looting, violence, and general lawlessness.
Yeah, you see those images on TV, and it's easy to think, okay,
right.
So this proves it right.
Yeah, it seemed to confirm that when the rules of society are suspended, our worst instincts take over.
And those stories, those images, they really stuck with people. But is it the full story? Did everyone just descend into chaos?
That's the question, isn't it? And it turns out that while there were certainly instances of crime and disorder, as you'd expect in any crisis of that magnitude, the vast majority of people were actually helping each other.
Really? So the opposite of what we tend to believe.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We have some firsthand accounts here from Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell.
Oh, I've heard of that.
She spent years researching how people behave in disasters, and her findings completely challenged the thin veneer narrative.
So what did she find? I mean, what was the common thread in these situations?
Well, Solnit argues that disasters often bring out the best in humanity. She found that in the aftermath of earthquakes, floods, fires, you typically see an outpouring of altruism, compassion, and spontaneous community formation.
So it's like this shared experience of hardship, of facing a common enemy.
Exactly.
That brings people together.
It creates a sense of solidarity that transcends our usual social divisions.
And her research shows that this isn't just a few isolated cases. This is actually how people tend to respond.
That's right. Solnit argues that this tendency towards cooperation and mutual aid is actually the norm in disasters, not the exception.
But then why do we hear so much about the looting and the violence?
Yeah.
Why does that narrative seem to dominate?
It's a good question, and Solnit has a term for this elite panic.
Elite panic.
It's this tendency of those in power to assume the worst of ordinary people during times of crisis. They expect chaos and disorder, so they overreact with authoritarian measures, which can actually create more problems than they solve.
It's like they need to believe in the thin veneer theory
Right.
to justify their own control.
It's a way of maintaining power, and the media, of course, often plays a role in amplifying that narrative. Sensational stories of crime and violence sell better than stories of everyday heroism and resilience.
Right, so we get this distorted view of what's actually happening on the ground. But getting back to Katrina, do you have any specific examples
Sure.
of this community self-organization that Solnit talks about?
Absolutely. One of the most inspiring stories from Katrina is that of Malik Rahim and the Common Ground Collective.
Okay, I've heard that name.
Rahim was a former Black Panther who stayed in New Orleans after the storm
Oh, wow.
and saw firsthand how the government was failing to meet the needs of the people, especially in the poorest neighborhoods.
So in a way, the thin veneer was cracking, but it was the veneer of government.
Exactly, and Common Ground stepped in to fill the void.
So what did they do?
They organized rescues, set up health clinics, provided food and shelter, all through volunteer efforts. They created a network of mutual aid that was completely independent of the government
That's amazing.
or any large institutions.
It really shows you what people can accomplish when they come together in a spirit of solidarity and self-reliance.
And what's really remarkable is that Common Ground didn't discriminate in who they helped. They treated everyone with compassion and respect, even some of the very people who had been promoting the narrative of lawlessness and violence.
So they were actively pushing back against that narrative.
They were showing through their actions that a different story was possible.
It really highlights how the stories we tell ourselves
Yeah.
can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we expect the worst of people,
Right.
that's often what we get. But if we focus on the potential for cooperation and compassion, we might be surprised by what emerges.
It's like we're choosing which seeds to plant and which ones to nurture.
I like that analogy.
Mm.
So are you saying we need to shift our focus
I think so.
from the thin veneer narrative to something else?
Exactly. Rebecca Solnit calls it the thick blanket narrative.
Thick.
Instead of seeing civilization as a fragile layer that can easily be stripped away, we need to recognize the deep reserves of human resilience, altruism, and the capacity for collective action.
That's a powerful image, the thick blanket of human connection that sustains us, even in the darkest of times. So if we're not just inherently selfish creatures waiting for society to collapse, then what does that say about human nature? What are we, if not just wolves in sheep's clothing?
Well, it's complicated, isn't it? We clearly have the capacity for both great good and great evil. But the evidence suggests that our default mode, especially in times of crisis, is towards cooperation and mutual aid. We're wired for connection, for empathy, for taking care of each other.
And that brings us back to that old story we started with,
Right.
the one about the two wolves battling within us.
Yeah.
Maybe the question isn't which wolf will win, but which wolf we choose to feed.
I like that framing.
If we focus on the negative, on the stories of violence and chaos, that's what we'll cultivate both in ourselves and in society.
But if we choose to highlight the stories of resilience, altruism, the everyday heroism that often goes unnoticed, that can have a powerful effect too.
It's about shifting our perception, seeing the world through a different lens.
Exactly, and recognizing that we're not just passive bystanders in this whole drama of human nature.
Right, we have agency. We have the power to choose the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we believe in, the stories we act upon.
And that brings us to our final thought for this deep dive. If our view of human nature shapes our reality, what kind of world do we want to create? Which wolf are we feeding? In our own lives, in our communities, and the way we interact with the world.
Because ultimately, the answer to that question will determine not only who we are,
Right.
but who we become.
Yeah. It's a powerful thought to end on this idea that we have a choice in which wolf we feed. And it's not just about individual choices either, is it? It's about the stories we tell as a society, the narratives we choose to elevate.
Right. Think about how we frame crime, for example. Do we focus on punishment and retribution, reinforcing the idea that people are inherently bad and need to be controlled?
Yeah.
Or do we focus on rehabilitation and restorative justice, recognizing that people can change and deserve a second chance?
It seems like those choices, those narratives, they have real-world consequences. They shape our policies, our institutions, our whole way of relating to each other. Absolutely. And it's not just about crime either. It's about how we approach poverty, education, healthcare, even climate change. Do we approach these challenges with a sense of fear and scarcity, assuming that people will only act in their own self-interest? Or do we approach them with a sense of hope and possibility, believing in our collective capacity to solve problems and create a better future?
You know, it's funny. We started this deep dive talking with the thin veneer theory, this idea that civilization is just a fragile layer covering our true savage selves. But after exploring these different perspectives, from Hobbes and Rousseau to the Stanford prison experiment and Hurricane Katrina, I'm starting to think that maybe the thin veneer isn't about civilization at all. Maybe it's about cynicism.
That's an interesting thought. Are you suggesting that cynicism itself is a kind of veneer, a way of distancing ourselves from the complexities of human nature?
Yeah, I think so. Because if we truly believe that people are inherently selfish and untrustworthy, then it becomes easier to justify all sorts of things. Inequality, exploitation, even violence.
Yeah.
But if we choose to believe in the possibility of goodness, then we're also choosing to believe in our own responsibility to create a world where that goodness can flourish.
And that's a much more challenging task, isn't it? It requires us to be more engaged, more compassionate, more willing to wrestle with difficult questions and messy realities. It's not a passive belief, it's a call to action.
It is, isn't it? It's about choosing to feed the wolf of hope, not just in ourselves, but in the world around us. And that's a choice we make every single day in the big ways and the small ways.
And that's the beauty of it, really. It's not about waiting for some grand societal transformation. It's about starting with ourselves, with the choices we make, the stories we tell, the way we interact with the people in our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the nature of humanity, I think the question we're left with isn't so much are we good or bad, but rather what kind of world do we want to create? And that's a question worth pondering, discussing, and most importantly, acting upon.
And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own exploration of these ideas. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.